She was just another TikToker in my feed, scrolling late at night, half asleep. She was funny, relatable, and stunning in a way that felt approachable. Not like those overly polished influencers, but real. Her laugh, her little quirks, the way she'd scrunch her nose when telling a story. It felt personal, like she was speaking directly to me. I liked her videos, obviously. Who wouldn't? I started commenting. Nothing weird, just the usual stuff. "This is hilarious," or "You're amazing, keep it up," stuff that everyone else was saying. But with me it felt different, like if she noticed my comment, she'd know I really meant it. But she didn't notice. Then the live stream started. That's when I thought I had my chance. I was there every single time the second she went live. I'd comment, I'd send little gifts, those stupid digital roses that cost more than they should. I watched her thank other people for their comments, acknowledge random names I'd never seen in the chat before, and every time she skipped over mine, it felt like a kick to the gut. Myself, she just didn't see them. There were loads of comments flying by, right? But it kept happening, stream after stream, week after week. I stayed loyal though, I showed up, always. I knew she'd notice me eventually. Only she didn't. It started eating at me. Every time she smiled at someone else's compliment or laughed at their joke, it felt like a personal rejection. I was putting in the effort, supporting her, being her biggest fan, and she couldn't even say my name once. I tried harder, made my comments stand out. They got sharper, louder. I called her out, asked why she was ignoring me. Nothing. That's when I realized it wasn't just coincidence. She was choosing to ignore me. My comments shifted. If kindness didn't work, then maybe honesty would. I let her know how unfair she was being, how I'd been there for her every step of the way, and how it felt like a betrayal. Still nothing. Until she blocked me. The notification hit like a sledgehammer. Just like that, I was gone from her world. All the time I'd invested, all the loyalty, the sleepless nights watching her streams, it meant nothing. I was erased, like I didn't matter. But I mattered. I remembered things, details from her posts. She'd mention her local coffee shop or show glimpses of her street during vlogs. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me a starting point. I spent hours remembering and writing down her content, piecing things together. It became a puzzle, a mission. I'd find her, and I'd make her see me. It's funny how much people reveal without realizing. A specific chain of shops in the background, the color of her bins, a university hoodie she wore once. The clues were all there if you were paying attention, and I always paid attention. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I had to. She forced my hand. Blocking me wasn't the answer, it was just avoidance. So I tracked down her city. From there, it was about narrowing it down. Small details, patterns, places she frequented. And now I'm close. Closer than she'd ever expect. I don't know what I'll say when I see her. Maybe I'll explain everything, how she made me feel, how her rejection changed something inside me. Or maybe I'll just watch her for a while, see how she is in real life when she's not performing for the screen. Either way, she'll notice me this time. She has to. She owes me that much. For years, I've been starting my mornings in the park. A coffee, a paper, and the peace of watching the world wake up. It's a small thing, but it keeps me grounded. Most days, it's the same crowd, a jogger or two, dog walkers, parents with prams. But that one morning, I saw her. She was standing by the pond with a little boy, tossing bits of bread to the ducks. Her hair caught the early sunlight, and she had this serene expression, like she was completely at peace in that moment. The boy was maybe 3 or 4, giggling and pointing as the ducks scrambled for the crumbs. She was just another passerby, just a pleasant sight to start my day. But she was there the next morning and the one after that. Always the same spot, the same routine. Her laughter as she encouraged the boy, the way she bent down to his level to talk to him. I started to picture myself there with them, standing beside her, maybe holding the boy's hand. We'd laugh together, feed the ducks as a family. It felt so natural, so right. I didn't even realize how much time I was spending just watching them until one morning I noticed she was leaving. Without thinking, I followed her. It wasn't planned. I just wanted to see where she went. She walked the boy to a nursery not far from the park, kissed him goodbye, and left. I watched for a while, pretending to check my phone, and then decided to see where she went next. She popped into a cafe, did some shopping, then walked home. Her house was in a quiet cul-de-sac. Nothing fancy, but nice. It was harmless curiosity. It wasn't like I was bothering her. She didn't even know I existed. This became my new routine. The mornings weren't enough anymore. I'd sit outside the park, then trail her day from a distance. I learned the shops she liked, the time she picked up her boy. She was always so prompt with that, never more than a minute or two late. But one afternoon she wasn't there. I was waiting near the nursery, expecting her usual punctual arrival, but the minutes stretched on. The staff started looking at the clock, the boy standing there with his little backpack, looking around. I thought, she must be stuck somewhere. I could help. It felt like the right thing to do. I'd been watching over them for weeks. It wasn't strange, was it? I'd bring the boy to her, make sure he was safe. When I approached the nursery, the staff looked skeptical. They asked for the boy's name, but I realized I didn't know it. I tried to explain, but their faces hardened. One of them stepped away, presumably to call someone. I panicked. I didn't mean to cause trouble, but it all spiraled so quickly. She showed up then, rushing in. I hung back, watching as they pulled her aside and explained what had happened. Her expression shifted from confusion to horror. I could feel her eyes scanning the area, and I slipped away before she could spot me. That night I couldn't sleep. I replayed the scene over and over, wondering if I'd overstepped. But the next morning I went back to the park. It was habit at this point. I waited for her, scanning the pond for that familiar pair, but they didn't come. Days passed, and still no sign of her. It felt like a hollow ache sitting there alone. But one morning I noticed someone new, a woman sitting on a bench reading, her toddler toddling around nearby. She had this calmness about her, a kindness in the way she watched her child. Something stirred in me again. Maybe this time things would be different. I've always been shy. Growing up, I wasn't the most confident guy, not like the other students who had no problem speaking to anyone. But then I saw her. I remember the first time I noticed her in class, sitting in the third row just across from me. Her long hair, the way she laughed at the professor's jokes, the way she carried herself. It was like everything about her was perfect. I couldn't help it. I had to know her. I'd sit next to her in lectures, try to start casual conversations. "Hey, how's it going? Did you understand the last lecture?" Simple things, just so she'd notice me, but she never really did. She'd smile, answer politely, but then she'd go back to her friends or her phone, and that was it. I tried harder, little by little. I'd catch up with her outside class, stand by her in the corridors, ask more about what she was studying. She'd always seem a bit distant, though. I could tell she was busy, always rushing off, not making much time for me, but I wasn't like the others. I was patient. I knew she just needed time to get to know me better. It wasn't enough for me to just see her at school. I wanted to know everything about her, so I found her on Instagram. It wasn't hard, honestly. Most people put their life online these days. I started liking her photos, commenting on everything she posted, things like, "Wow, you look amazing," or "You really know how to take a great picture." It didn't take long before she noticed. She started liking my comments back, a few replies. "Thanks," or "That's sweet of you." I thought that was progress. She was starting to pay attention to me, and then one day she followed me back, just like that. I felt like I had won, like it was a sign that she was finally seeing me the way I saw her. I went through her posts, liking everything, commenting on all her photos, even going back years to older pictures. I couldn't get enough of her. Every new post, every new update. It was like I was living her life through the screen. But I wanted more than just her online presence. I started showing up more often in person. I'd wait outside her lectures, sit near her at lunch, catch her as she left the library. Sometimes she'd look at me like I was a bit strange, but she wasn't used to someone paying so much attention to her. I wasn't stalking her, I was just there for her, watching out for her. She needed someone like me, I could tell. One day she confronted me. We were in the library and I was sitting close by. I'd followed her there, as usual. She turned to me, her face hardening, and she asked, "Why do you keep doing this?" My heart skipped a beat. She was finally talking to me, really talking to me. This was my moment. I looked into her eyes and I said the words I'd been rehearsing in my mind for weeks. "You belong with me, you always have, you just don't see it yet." She recoiled like I'd slapped her. Her face went pale and she stood up abruptly, backing away. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You're being weird." I could feel my chest tightening, but I wasn't scared. She just needed time to understand. I wasn't doing anything wrong. She was mine, and she didn't even realize it yet. I could feel it. She wanted me deep down. She just didn't know how to admit it. The next day she went to the tutor. I could see her talking to him after class, pointing at me and saying something, probably about how I was bothering her. I'd heard rumors before about people getting too obsessed with others. But it didn't matter. But that they didn't know us. They didn't know what we were meant to be. A few days later, I got an email. The university had suspended me for my actions. They said I'd been harassing her, that I crossed boundaries, but that wasn't true. She just didn't understand yet. I didn't care. I knew I couldn't stop now. She was mine. I kept going to classes, though. I figured they couldn't keep me away from her forever. I still sat in my usual seat, tried to make eye contact, but she'd just ignore me. She pretended she didn't see me, but I knew. I could feel the tension in the air. She was scared, but she was also drawn to me in a way. A few weeks passed, and she didn't show up to class anymore. Maybe she was scared of me. Maybe she was just taking a break. I didn't know. But I couldn't stop thinking about her, couldn't stop needing to see her. I'd show up to her classes, wait for her outside. I checked her social media like always, watching her posts like they were the only thing keeping me sane. I knew she'd come back. She had to. She'll realize what I've known all along, that she belongs with me. I don't care what anyone says. She was meant to be mine. One day she'll understand. The company retreat was meant to be just another tick-box exercise, team-building nonsense and awkward small talk. I wasn't looking forward to it, but it turned out to be more than I'd expected. That's where I met her properly. Sure, I'd known her before. She was my team leader after all, but seeing her outside the office, it was different. She wasn't just the sharp, confident boss everyone respected. She was funny, warm, and had this way of looking at you that made you feel like the only person in the room. It was the second night of the retreat, after a few drinks, when things shifted. A private conversation turned into something more. It felt like one of those moments that changes everything. I thought it was mutual, that she felt it too. Back at the office, though, things cooled. She pulled me aside one afternoon, said it had been a mistake. She wanted to keep things professional, like it hadn't meant anything. She looked so certain, so detached, as if the night we'd shared had been nothing more than a glitch in her perfect, controlled world. But it had meant something, at least to me. I tried to let it go at first. Really, I did. But it was impossible. Every meeting, every casual greeting in the hallway, every email, it was there, this unspoken tension. She acted like she'd moved on, but I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of recognition. She wasn't as unaffected as she pretended to be. I started noticing things about her I hadn't paid attention to before, the way she tapped her pen when she was thinking, the way she stayed at her desk after everyone else had left. She'd push her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. It was intoxicating. She kept her distance, though, too much distance. I tried to bridge it, find reasons to talk to her, but she brushed me off, always so polite yet cold. It was maddening. How could she just walk away from what we'd had like it was nothing? One evening I decided to stay late, just to see if she'd be there too. She was. Her office light was still on when most of the building had emptied. I watched from my desk as she packed her things, that same controlled air about her. She didn't look my way as she left. I started noticing her routine more after that. It wasn't intentional at first, just small observations. What time she arrived at work, the cafe she stopped at in the morning, the route she took home, little things that became easy to spot once I was paying attention. It wasn't creepy. It wasn't like I was doing anything wrong. I just wanted to understand her better, to figure out what I'd done that made her push me away. But the more I saw, the more confused I became. She seemed so normal, so unaffected, like what happened between us had genuinely been a blip in her otherwise perfect life. It made me angry, the way she could just compartmentalize everything, like I was some disposable mistake. It wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. One day I noticed her at lunch with someone else, a man. They were laughing, sitting closer than colleagues should. It felt like a slap. She'd moved on, hadn't she? And here I was, still trying to make sense of it all. I couldn't let that be the end of the story. You don't just discard someone like that without consequence. She needed to understand what she'd done, to acknowledge the connection we had. But every time I tried to get her to see it, she shut me out further, building this wall of professionalism around herself like armor. I don't know what I expected when I started paying closer attention to her life, her habits, her choices. Maybe I thought she'd slip, let the mask drop and show me she felt something too, but she never did. She just carried on, oblivious to the storm she'd left behind. It's exhausting being ignored like that, being treated like you're invisible. But I'll wait. Eventually she'll have to face me. No one can keep their guard up forever. I've worked at the same 24-hour diner for years now, and over time you get used to the regulars, the late-night crowd, the oddballs who show up at 3 in the morning when the place is quiet. But there's one man who stands out, not because of anything particularly special about him, but because of his consistency. Every night, without fail, he sits at the same booth right at the back near the kitchen. I've never seen him with anyone, never heard him speak to another customer. He orders the same meal every time, a coffee and a greasy bacon sandwich, nothing fancy. He never looks at the menu, just sits there staring into space. I thought it was just a habit, something he did to pass the time. But over time, I started noticing he never finishes his coffee, always leaves half of it untouched. And the sandwich, it's like he just pushes it around on his plate. He hardly eats it. I've asked him a couple of times if he's okay, if he wants anything else, but he never really responds. He just looks up at me, barely nodding, and then goes back to staring out the window or at the wall like he's waiting for something. I got used to it. Everyone else did too. He became part of the diner's night shift. But then one night, it was around 2 a.m., and the diner was pretty quiet. Just the usual late-night folks, the insomniacs and truck drivers stopping in for a quick bite. He was there, of course, sitting at his usual spot, his coffee half full, the sandwich untouched, staring out the window like he always did. But this time there was something different. He wasn't eating. He wasn't even touching his food. He was just staring at it. I figured he was having one of those nights, the kind where you don't feel like eating, but you don't want to leave either. I've seen it before. He had a napkin in front of him. I couldn't see what he was doing with it at first, but when I walked by his table to refill his coffee, I saw the faintest traces of scribbling on the napkin. He was writing something. I tried not to stare, but curiosity got the better of me. I watched him for a few seconds longer, but then he looked up at me, just for a second, and I quickly moved away, pretending I hadn't seen. Later that night, when he finally stood to leave, he left the napkin on the table. The coffee was still there, cold and untouched. I cleared the table like I always did, collecting the plates, and that's when I saw it. The napkin, the scribbled words. "I'll see you after work." My heart skipped. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it a joke? Was it a message for someone else? I tossed the napkin into the bin. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those words in my mind, carved into the napkin like a warning. The next few days were uneventful. He came in every night just like always. Same booth, same order, same silence. But now I watched him more closely, trying to figure out what he wanted. Why me? Why did he think I'd even notice something like that? It was the third night after the note when it happened. I was walking to my car after my shift, just about to unlock the door when I saw him. He was standing in the parking lot, just on the edge of the diner's lot. He wasn't looking at me, but I could feel his eyes on me. I froze. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to walk up and ask if he needed something, maybe figure out what was going on. But the other part of me was terrified. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this felt normal. Instead, I turned and rushed to my car, got inside and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't even check the rearview mirror. I just drove. The next day, I found myself avoiding the diner. I tried to convince myself I wasn't some kind of target. But when I went back to work a couple of nights later, there he was again, sitting at the same booth, staring into space, just like always. This time, though, he wasn't just sitting there. He was writing again. I watched him for a while, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up when I realized what he was doing. He wasn't scribbling nonsense this time. No, it was worse. He was writing my name, over and over again, my full name. He was focused, like he was carving it into the napkin. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to scream, run out of the diner, but I stayed. I had to stay. Later, when he left, I went to clear his table. I didn't want to look at the napkin, but I couldn't stop myself. It was there, the words, my name, written in sharp, frantic lines, and beneath it one final phrase, "After work, I'll be waiting." I don't know how I managed to keep my composure. I didn't show it, but inside I was shaking. I don't know what he wants or why it feels like he's been watching me for longer than just these past few nights. I don't know how long I can keep pretending it's nothing. You don't realize how easy it is to become a part of someone's life until you're right there all the time, and they don't even notice. I used to think I was a fairly normal guy, quiet, nothing special, just going about my days. I worked a boring desk job, spent most of my time in my flat watching TV or reading and occasionally meeting up with a friend for a drink. But that was before I started going to a different supermarket. She was just another cashier, another face behind the till. But then, it was like I couldn't stop noticing her. She had this way about her. It wasn't anything obvious at first. The way she'd smile when she gave back change, or the way she'd tuck her hair behind her ear when she was focusing on the register. It was like watching someone who didn't know they were beautiful. At first, I didn't know what to do with the feelings I had. I'd go into the shop for normal reasons. Buy a loaf of bread, some milk, whatever. But then I realized I was going in more often than I needed to. I didn't even have to buy anything anymore. I'd just stand there in the queue, watching her, trying not to let my heart race. But that wasn't enough. I started making excuses. "Oh, I forgot some eggs," I'd tell myself, even though I knew perfectly well I didn't need eggs, and it wasn't just once or twice. No, it was more like 5, 6 times a day. I'd go in, pretend I needed something, and stand at her till, trying to make small talk. I never said much, just asked how her day was going or commented on the weather. She'd smile politely, but I could tell she didn't care. She didn't even look at me half the time. I could see it in her eyes, the way she'd look past me like I wasn't even there. It felt like a challenge, like if I tried harder, maybe she'd notice me. Maybe she'd really see me. I'd gone in for some milk, again. And when I approached the checkout, I saw her walk away. She didn't say anything to me, but she didn't have to. I watched her head for the break room, and without thinking, I followed her. It wasn't like I was stalking her or anything. It was just, I wanted to be near her, that's all. So I waited. After a while, she left the break room and the store. I watched as she went across the road and head to a cafe. I didn't think it would be weird if I went in too, right? I mean, what were the chances of us both being in the same cafe? It seemed like fate. I walked in, pretending I hadn't seen her yet, and there she was, sitting by the window, sipping a coffee and reading a book. I swear, I didn't mean for it to look like I was stalking her. It was just a coincidence. I walked past her table and accidentally bumped into her chair. She looked up, startled for a second, but I quickly mumbled an apology and sat at the counter. I kept sneaking glances at her, pretending I wasn't watching. I could tell she was uncomfortable for some reason, but she didn't leave. It didn't matter, though. After a while, she got up to leave. She didn't even look at me. She didn't need to. She wasn't there for me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just keep pretending like I wasn't a part of her life. She had to notice me. She had to understand that we were connected. So I started doing it every day. I'd go to the store more often, find some excuse to make her notice me. I'd follow her to the cafe, sit near her, always just close enough so she could feel me watching her. Every day, a little closer. But I knew I had to be careful. I couldn't just rush things. It would have been too obvious, so I kept my distance, played the game just right. I started sitting at the same table at the same time, and over the weeks I became a fixture in her routine. She still didn't notice me, of course. I mean, why would she? She had no reason to, but I noticed her. I knew everything about her now, the way she'd sip her coffee before reading a page, the way she'd tap her foot when she was lost in thought, even the way she pushed her glasses up her nose when they slipped. It felt comfortable, like I was a part of her life, even if she didn't know it. I don't know when it happened, but at some point, I started thinking that if I just kept doing this, she'd have to notice me eventually, and when she did, I'd be ready. I knew the right words to say. I'd make her feel special, like no one else had ever paid attention to her the way I had. But it wasn't just about the cafe anymore. It was about everything. The way she moved, the way she talked, the way she walked out of the shop, always with her bag slung over one shoulder. I knew the exact time she'd finish her shift, the route she'd take home. I could even anticipate when she'd smile, when she'd look down at her phone, when she'd pass by my flat on her way to the bus stop. It was perfect. I had everything I needed. All I had to do now was wait. Soon enough, she'd realize. She'd see that we were meant to be, that we'd always been meant to be. You think it's easy to walk away from someone who loves you, but you don't realize how deep their obsession goes until it's too late. It all started when I broke up with Rachel. I thought it would be simple. We had been together for a while, and honestly, it just wasn't working. We argued constantly, and it felt like we were both clinging to something that was already long gone, so I ended it. Thought that was that. I moved on. But Rachel didn't. At first, it was just a couple of texts. She said she understood that it was hard, but she respected my decision. Then she would send me Facebook messages. More texts, long paragraphs asking me to reconsider. "We can make it work," she'd write. "I can change. We can start fresh." I thought it was a phase, that she'd get over it, but the text didn't stop. I blocked her, figured that would be the end of it, but that was the first mistake. Rachel wasn't the type to give up. It didn't take long for her to create a new account on Facebook, a new number, and she was back at it again. The messages started flooding in. This time they weren't just desperate, they were needy. She'd tell me how she missed me, how she couldn't breathe without me, how she didn't want to be alone. She didn't stop. She wouldn't stop. I blocked her again, thought maybe it would sink in. She popped up on Instagram, then Twitter, then email. She was everywhere, always asking why I wouldn't talk to her, why I wouldn't answer her calls. It felt like I couldn't escape her. I couldn't even go a day without seeing her name flashing up on my screen. It got worse. The messages started turning darker. They were just pleading, but then they became accusatory. "You never really loved me," she'd say. "You're just using me." And then the threatening ones, "You'll regret this. I'm not going anywhere. I'll wait for you." They came more and more frequently. It started to feel like a weight I couldn't shake off. It felt like she was right there, just waiting to pop up at any moment. I started ignoring the messages. No replies, no reactions, just silence. I thought if I didn't engage, she'd eventually get the message. Eventually it stopped. I breathed a sigh of relief. I thought maybe, just maybe, she had finally accepted it. When I stepped into my bedroom, I saw her. She was sitting there in my bed, just staring at me with this weird, calm expression. It didn't feel real. It didn't feel like she should be there, but she was. She was in my space, where she had no right to be. I froze. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to scream, part of me wanted to run out the door, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen in place, as she stared at me like it was the most natural thing in the world. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke, but she didn't need to say anything, did she? Because her eyes, the way she looked at me like we were still a couple, like we'd never broken up, said everything. She looked at me with that same look she had when we were together, that same needy, possessive look, like I was hers, and in that moment I realized something. She wasn't just obsessed. She believed we were meant to be. She believed that no matter how many times I blocked her, no matter how many times I ignored her, we would always end up back together. She had it all figured out in her mind. We belonged together. And nothing, not even my rejection, could change that. I don't know what happened next. I don't know how she got in or what she thought she was doing, but I couldn't stop her. It was like I was paralyzed. She didn't leave that night. She stayed in my bed, in my life, in my head. Now, I don't know how to get rid of her. I don't know how to make her understand that I don't want her there. I don't know how to stop her from thinking we're some kind of love story that hasn't ended yet. She won't stop, and I'm starting to realize she never will. She's right. We do belong together, and I'll never escape her. It was a simple weekend hike, just me, my backpack and the woods. A bit of peace and quiet to clear my head. Everyone else had their plans, but I needed some time on my own. There's something about being out in nature that just makes you feel alive again. The trail was busy when I started, but it thinned out the further I went. You know the kind of trail I'm talking about, the sort that's well known, but still feels isolated when you get far enough in. Beautiful scenery, the sound of birds, the crunch of leaves underfoot. I was enjoying the calm until I noticed him. At first it didn't seem strange, just an old man, probably in his 70s, with a walking stick. He was a fair distance behind me, but not too far. I thought he was just another hiker, minding his own business. The thing was, no matter how many side paths I took, he kept up. I'd change direction, take a little detour around a bend, trying to shake him off. But there he was, still back there, moving at a steady pace, never too far behind. After a while, it started to make me uncomfortable. He never seemed to break stride, and every time I looked over my shoulder, I could see him. Not too close, but always just there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I decided to pick up the pace. I started jogging, and sure enough, the old man started running after me. He was gaining on me. His legs were creaking, but he was moving fast for someone his age. The sound of his footsteps pounding the dirt behind me grew louder. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest, my heart racing as I pushed myself harder. But no matter how fast I ran, I could hear him right there, always close. Then he started screaming. The words didn't make sense, they were jumbled, but the anger in his voice was clear. It was terrifying. The thought crossed my mind that maybe he was out of his mind, maybe he had lost it. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't keep running forever, so I found cover. I ducked into some thick brush and held my breath, praying he hadn't seen me. The sounds of his footsteps didn't stop, though. He was still running fast, but then he stopped. I couldn't see him, but I could hear him now. He was pacing around the area, moving like he was searching for me. Every now and then I heard a twig snap or a leaf crunch underfoot. It was like he was circling. I held my position as still as I could, barely breathing. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest. I waited for what felt like hours, listening to the breaking of sticks and the rustling of leaves, but there was no sign of him. I thought maybe I was safe. Maybe he had moved on. I didn't dare risk looking around, but after 20 minutes I started to feel like I was alone again. He must have left, right? I moved slowly, cautiously. I peeked out from the brush, making sure to keep low. Everything was still, no sounds, no movement, but I saw him. He wasn't far though. He was right there, standing in the clearing, waiting for me. There he was, just standing in the middle of the trail. My heart sank. I had no time to think, no time to plan. I bolted again. This time I didn't care about the trail, the trees, the ground beneath me. I ran like I had never run before. I didn't look back. I just ran until my legs felt like they were going to give out. Finally, after what felt like hours, I burst out of the trees, out onto the open field near the edge of the trail. I stopped, gasping for breath. I couldn't hear him anymore. I was finally free. I turned around, expecting to see him behind me, but there was nothing. No old man, no footsteps, just the wind in the trees. I was alone. We had been colleagues for months before it all shifted. She was the bright, enthusiastic type, always friendly, always willing to help, and I was just the quiet guy in the IT department who kept to himself. I didn't expect anything to come of it, but she was different. We started chatting more, just small talk, work stuff. Then we'd talk over lunch, and gradually it became something else. I was drawn to her energy, her laugh, the way she made even the dullest office meetings feel more interesting. She would often lean over my desk with a question, and each time the smell of her perfume would linger in the air long after she'd gone. I could tell she enjoyed the attention, that it was something she hadn't expected from me. When things started to get more personal, I convinced myself it was mutual. We didn't talk about it, didn't make it official, but there were looks, touches, and eventually a quiet, stolen kiss in a break room. I thought it was the beginning of something more, but then she ended it. It didn't come out of nowhere. She had been distant for a while, less playful, more formal, but I didn't want to admit it. I told myself she was just busy, distracted, that it was nothing serious until it was. One afternoon I was sitting at my desk just after lunch when she came by to tell me it wasn't working. She said she needed space, needed to focus on her career. I understood, or at least I told myself I did. But the reality was different. I wasn't ready for it to end. Not like this. I told myself it wasn't personal, that she was probably just trying to keep things professional, but every time I saw her at the coffee machine, laughing with someone else, I could feel the anger build. She had no idea what she was doing to me, what she was making me feel. It was like a switch had been flipped, and I couldn't stop the thoughts from swirling. It wasn't just rejection anymore, it was humiliation. I wanted her to feel what I was feeling. I wanted her to know that she had made a mistake, that she couldn't just throw me away like this and go on with her life as if nothing had happened. So I started my plan. It was the little things at first, filling out an anonymous form suggesting that she wasn't meeting her targets, or making sure a report she'd worked hard on had an error that only I knew how to fix. Then the rumors. I watched from a distance, but I was always there. Whenever there was a team meeting, I made sure to be there. I was quiet, of course, but I always made sure to notice how she reacted when things didn't go her way. It was subtle, just the way her hand would tremble when the pressure was on, the way she would glance at her phone when she thought no one was looking, trying to keep it together. The worst part was how no one seemed to notice. To everyone else, she was just having a rough patch, just a little off. They didn't see what I saw, the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she would hesitate before taking on new tasks, like she was already fighting a battle behind the scenes. But I could see it. I knew exactly how to push her buttons, how to make everything just a little bit harder for her. I'd make sure she got left out of important meetings. I'd make sure her projects were buried under piles of paperwork, her email inbox flooded with reminders of deadlines she couldn't possibly meet. She hated it, but I loved it. It felt like revenge, sure, but it wasn't just that. It was about control. The control I didn't have when she ended things. Now, I had the power to ruin her day, to frustrate her at every turn, and she never knew where it was coming from. The more I pushed, the more she started to withdraw. She wouldn't join the usual lunch breaks with the rest of the team. She barely spoke in meetings anymore. It was as if she had given up. One day she came to my department. She had a question about the system, something simple that could have been handled by someone else, but she came to me anyway. She stood there in front of my desk, her eyes meeting mine for the first time in weeks. And in that moment, I could see it in her face, the realization. She knew. She might not know exactly how it was happening, but she knew something was off. She wasn't stupid. I saw the way she swallowed, the way she forced a smile, trying to be polite, but it was too late. She'd already broken the rules. She had made me feel small, rejected, discarded. And now I had her where I wanted her. I continued my little games, always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike, but things didn't stop there. Eventually, she had a breakdown, a full-on panic attack in the middle of a presentation, in front of the whole team. It was perfect. She couldn't hide it anymore. I saw it in her eyes when she tried to pull herself together, but it was clear she was cracking. I didn't know what came over me when I saw her crumble. It should have been satisfying. She had deserved it, right? But all I felt was emptiness, like I had pushed her too far and now there was nothing left but the ruins of what used to be. The next day, she wasn't in the office. The HR department was notified and rumors started circulating about her absence, but I stayed in the background watching, knowing I'd gotten exactly what I wanted. She never came back. The office carried on without her, as it always does. People forgot. New faces came and went, but I didn't forget. I knew that even if she was gone, the damage had been done. She would never forget me. We were a group of 4, just a few mates getting away from the city for the weekend. A weekend in the woods to unwind, no distractions, just a few beers, a campfire, and a chance to talk without the usual noise of daily life. The hike in was peaceful, the air was fresh, and the campsite was perfect. Secluded and far enough from the trail to feel like we had the place to ourselves. Everything was great. We set up our tents, got the fire going, and started cooking. No one else seemed to be around. It was just us, the trees, and the crackling of the fire. One of the guys, Mark, went to grab some snacks from the food bin and noticed something strange. The bag of crisps he was after was half empty, even though we'd all checked it before setting up camp. It didn't make sense, because no one had been near it except for us. We laughed it off. Probably just a mistake, right? Maybe someone forgot to close it properly and an animal got to it. But then it kept happening. The next morning I found that one of the cans of beans we'd brought was gone. No one had eaten it, no one had taken it. It wasn't just the food, though. Our gear, our rucksacks, our jackets had been moved. I swear I'd left mine in one spot, but now it was a few feet away, slightly turned. We then found something we couldn't ignore. Footprints. They were right outside the edge of the campsite. I thought it was one of us. Maybe someone had gone out for a piss in the middle of the night without telling anyone. But when we all compared our boots, none of us had shoes that matched the size or shape of the prints. They were bigger, deeper in the ground. The prints led off into the woods, but they didn't come back. That's when the paranoia started to set in. We couldn't stop looking over our shoulders. It didn't help that we couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. Every little sound, the rustling of leaves, the crack of a branch made us jump. It got worse. The fire was burning low and the air had grown cold. We sat around it trying to act normal, but no one could really relax. We kept talking, but it felt like our voices were too loud, like we were trying to drown out the silence around us. It was Mark who first heard the twigs snapping. He stiffened, his eyes darting towards the trees. We thought it was an animal, a deer or a fox, but then the snapping came again, closer. It sounded like someone stepping carefully, but couldn't help break a few twigs. We all fell silent. The fire flickered in the breeze, and the world around us seemed to hold its breath. Then we heard it again, the sound of something or someone walking just beyond the firelight. We were completely still, not daring to move or speak. We all knew something was out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. After what felt like hours of silence, I decided to go for a walk. I don't know why, but I thought maybe I could calm myself down by seeing if I could spot anything, maybe even catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and told the others I'd be back in 10 minutes just to check the area. I didn't hear any objections, but I could tell they were all nervous. I stepped off the edge of the campsite, shining the light across the trees. The beams swept back and forth, scanning the undergrowth. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing still between 2 trees, just outside the beam of the flashlight. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. For a moment I thought I was seeing things, but then it moved. Slowly, and then it was gone. I rushed back to camp, my pulse racing. I didn't say anything when I got back, but I saw the same panic in the others' eyes. They knew too. We didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had us on edge. At one point, we thought we heard talking from the trees. In the morning, we packed up quickly, trying to keep calm. But when we looked around, we saw more footprints, this time circling the camp. The prints weren't ours. They led off into the woods again, deeper than before, and we didn't follow. We left.